Build a dam, block the stream, work the furnaces night and day.
We don't have enough fuel to feed the fires.
The forest of Fangorn lies on our doorstep. Burn it.
Yeah.
You're about to see a 30-minute film of a way of life that existed up until just a few years ago. What you see may amaze you as to the fact that the way the cypress was harvested out in the woods, and the type of labor and the type of conditions that they work with. However, I believe that you'll find this a very interesting film, and it's also a way of life that does not exist anymore. Cumbersund Cypress Company is no longer in existence, and the big cypress mills of the past have all gone. The only thing that remains are the small band mills that cut small cypress. The huge monarchs of the cypress are a thing of the past. Just for your information, cypress trees were full grown the day that the giant sequoias of California first sprung from the ground. It was not unusual to cut a tree that had been in existence for more than 3,000 years. Relating back to the one that the man just crawled over, it was probably a full-grown tree the day that Christ was born, and it took just a few minutes to cut it down, and it has been changed into a way of lumber and a kind of lumber that is almost impossible to find. Of course, there's a few trees left in scattered remote areas that makes it almost impossible to harvest. The crews that you see going into the woods, this is a daily occurrence. Happened summer and winter. Had no regard to time or to rain or to cold weather. They'll notch the tree on one side, then they'll do their cutting with their hand-driven cross-cut saws on the back side of that notch, and they can just about drive a peg in the ground with where that tree will fall. They were that good. There's a nice one that's falling. You can see in the butt end, you can see a small cavity that they don't know why those cavities are in cypress, but sometime they would go up through the entire tree, sometime they would stop at a couple of foot. They usually cut those off at the mill. It almost makes you want to cry when you see those great big trees that had stood for 2,000 or 3,000 years take their last dive. Also the ending of an era too. This is the 104 engine that was the last working steam engine in the state of Florida. It's now in a museum resting place more or less at Leesburg. There's the 104 there. Makes a beautiful sight, is it? That's not the 104 either. That's a Seaboard Coastline engine, or Seaboard Airline engine at that time, taking them along the main track back to where they will come into La Cucci. The man down there is having a little bit of tough footing, and he's also carrying the crosscut, as you can well see. They're doing their notching the same way as you saw it in the past. They're notching it, and this will be falling into the river, and then they'll float it from there down to their nearest pickup point. And you can see the ring on the trees where the high water marks are too. The high water mark is just below the axe handle there. They'll walk out now and cut the topping out of the tree, which they would leave in the wood, or leave in the river, or leave wherever they cut it. This is the 104 coming back in with a full train load of logs. You'll probably never ever, you may see a train load of logs, but it'll never be cypress again. This was in the fall, I would assume, by the way the leaves on the trees are, and the water had been pretty cool at that time. Little red caboose on the back end tells you it's on a main line, which is ACL or Seaboard Airlines at that time. This is a shot in the mill yard where they used to dump them off of the trains, and then the big skidder back in the back was run by Mr. Joe Hull, or the big crane in the back was run by Mr. Joe Hull. And that crane that you just passed over, which you'll see again, helped dig the Panama Canal and was bought by Cummersons, or at that time the Cummer Cypress Company, at the yard at the Naval Yard in Jacksonville. You'll see the log going up in the mill. On the right, on the left is where they send the logs up into the mill for veneer. That's your 104. Beautiful little Baldwin engine, and in a few minutes you'll hear it. This is something that OSHA would always frown upon. But they always did it, and it did it from the time the mill started. That young man would hang by the tongs, and he would ride the tongs from the loading area to the chain, and from the chain to the loading area, depending on what they were doing. This is a view of just the mill. That back in the back was the sawdust house. In the front was the steam chambers where they steamed pine before they sent it over to the veneer mill, and that was a veneer mill just a second ago. This is a panoramic view of Cummer. Sorry the film didn't come out better, but this was taken quite a few years ago, and time has taken its toll on the film. This kind of timber would not have been cut during the first years of Cummerson Cypress Company. This was kind of a scrapping up operation. This size timber was only taken into the mill after everything else had been pretty well cut out. Now they did have some big timber there, but it was very, very scattered and very few of them. I'd like to call your attention to the size and the weight of that chainsaw that man is working with there. That was probably one of the first chainsaws and weighed about 10 times of what the modern chainsaws were. Now he's going to drive that peg in and drop the tree in a particular direction. I think they found it easier than notching, but I'm not an expert enough to know. The local ecologists would go banana over this type of operation, but it would not take nature but a few years and a couple of good rains until all the marks of this sort of devastation of the natural environment would be removed, and you could never tell, excepting for a few small trails that they'd ever cut in that area. Of course, the stumps would be there as reminders, and the trees would not return that quick, but you could not tell environmentally that they'd ever cut there. Two for one on this one. He's hooked two at one time and pulling them out. Obviously they're hooking 3 or 4 logs together to pull out to their loading area. Didn't take any sleeping pills to get you to sleep after a night of this kind of work. This is back into the loading area where they're loading them on trucks to take to the, I'll apologize for the blip, but I can't help that. They load them on trucks to take back to the railroad, and they would dump them at the railroad and load them on the trains to be pulled from the Everglades up to Lacoochee. This took the best out of equipment and men to keep an operation like this going. It was very, very hard work. People who do this seem to have a knack for it and don't particularly like to change jobs. It's overhead skidder that they use to, overhead loading apparatus they use to load them on the trucks. Pretty good load there, but it's all small timber. You'll see some bigger timber in a few minutes, but this is all small stuff and really not a prime grade of cypress as far as cypress was concerned. There's a pretty good sized log there. You can see how they bolstered that loader in the back there with the rails in the middle to keep it from bending when they hooked those big logs. This, by the way, is the last train load of cypress logs that was ever loaded and pulled across the track in Florida. When this load reaches the Lacucci mill, that will be the end of an era that I doubt will ever come back. And there she is. That's the last, not the completed train, but most of the completed train of logs. The gentleman there in the front is a foreman, and I'll have to admit I've forgotten his name over the years. Bill McKinstry again, who's responsible for both of these films, the first one and this one. That's the 3-spot, I believe there, the original 3-spot, if I remember right. And that train that you're looking at on the end of those cars, the last time that it was officially used, besides this, it was used in the winds over the Everglades with burl ives. If you remember the train that was in that, that's the train. They came down to Florida, fixed it up, painted it up, doctored it up, made it look pretty, and pulled it for its last, the last picture show of that area. That's a homemade donkey that you see in front there, yellow and black. That was probably one of the first diesels that was ever used at Lacucci. It was not factory built. It was built by a bunch of mechanics, and it's diesel powered. It was used mainly just to do what you see doing there. It would pull usually one and sometimes two cars, depending on the weight and the level of the road, from one area to the other, rather than crank up the steam engine. There's your little engine. That's the 7 spot. I think I called it the 3. That is the 7 spot. That's the one that was in winds over the Everglades. Both depots are gone now. Of course, both tracks are gone. They're backing it into the Cummer siding, and then at the Cummer siding, the 104, which is in Lacucci at this time, we'll pick it up from here and take it on down to the mill where it will be unloaded. Photography wasn't too great in spots, but luckily it doesn't last forever. That's the 104. She's hooked onto them and taking them up the grade to the mill in Lacucci. That was a beautiful little bald one, and one I told you about that is up at Leesburg now. This is taken from Mr. Joe Hull's crane there. We got on the side of the crane. I didn't get Mr. Hull. I wish I had of it. He ran that crane for some 30 years. They're backing them into place where they'll unload them. The man you see there with the white shirt is Mr. Charles Bergstresser from Lacucci. He was superintendent of the crepe mill for, well, I guess since it began, as far as I know. And he had come down to the area to watch this last load come in. This is a panoramic view of the old Cumberson Cypress Company's commissary and their gasoline area, a few of the houses. Then we'll swing across to the water tank that's still in Lacoochee, by the way. Not in use, but it's still there. That happens to be the crate mill. A couple of the trucks. And this is the pay office area here. That's the pay office. We got a view of that too. Cumber paid in cash. They never paid with checks. Every week they paid all their employees with cash. Quite a day. This is a mistake here. I think somebody took a picture of our office in the Dade City at that time and didn't know I had the camera loaded up for this. This comes that free ride again I showed you before, and he's still doing it. If you notice, he'll wiggle his feet, makes a semicircle, and that takes the continuing pressure off his arms and makes it easier for him to hang on, and that's literally hanging on for dear life. He's hooking a rather large log now. This is several days later, and Bill McKinstry saved back a couple of the larger logs to go through the mill to be the last one to go through. And this is, I believe, the last one as it's being hooked to go up on the chain that will take it into the mill. Log probably 3,000 years old, 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Otis Clark ran the little steam engine, or a little steam loader back in the back for many years. Notice that yard, for the first time in the history of that mill, is now barren and bare. They knew this was coming, but nobody ever believed it. Got to have our picture taken for this, haven't we? Okay, if you'll notice just 1 second, Mr. Joe Hull will blow that. See that steam coming out? He's calling it quits. That's his final swan song, and he'll cut that crane down and be later sold and I think scrapped out. This is in the mill itself. The big logs would go in, and that little baby right there would come down and cut them into whatever lengths of board that they wanted out of that log. That's quite a little size log there. You saw here in this one Mr. Lynn Burnsett. Mr. Burnsett is still up in Lacoochee, and you can see by the size of that log you've got a good cut coming out of her. He operated that 30-foot bandsaw. The man on the carriage there would ride back and forth and do 1,000 miles a day and go nowhere. It was his job to turn that log whichever way the sawyer would call for it, and to set the size of timber, the thickness of the timber to be cut. The sawyer will give him a hand signal as to what he wants to cut out of the log, and it's up to the man on the carriage to turn that log with those steam dogs, as they called them, to whatever cut he wanted. This is Jesse Stanley. Jesse Stanley was with the Cumber Company for many, many, many years. Lynn Burns again, and he's sizing that log up real good. See him hold his hand up there? They're both verifying what kind of cut he's going to get on the next one. Just notice the size of that log and the grain in that cypress. That's a very pretty log. Sawyer's hand never stopped. He's trimming the log up there, but if you'll notice, that hand never stops. He's riding the saw back to shape up his log and clean it up for the next cut. This is a gang saw. You cut them up into whatever size timbers you wanted, one by whatever it was, and he'd run it through that gang and cut them all at one time. at some of the people in the mill. They're standing around. They know that this is it, and that end of their livelihood for one thing, and also end of a era for something else. You're sorry you hear is Bill Searles. Bill Searles sawed for many years out there on that saw, and some of the excitement that comes with his job is when that 30-foot bandsaw breaks and it slices all over that mill like a mad snake. Everybody starts ducking and dodging. Beautiful 1-inch boards coming out of that. Bill was quite proficient at his job, and I guess you classifies him as one of the best. Mr. Rickard there, and I flashed by a couple of others that I wish I'd slowed down on now. Mr. Rickard was in many years there. This is all the people waiting around for this last day to come to its inevitable end. Bill cutting that log like he had 1,000,000 before it in his usual efficient manner. He also realizes that he's coming to an end of an era. There she is. Now this is the last cut. When you see this one drop and that main one that onto the hooks go, that will be the end of the cutting at the Cypress Mill in Lacoochee, Florida. He held his fingers up for his cut, and he's going to yank it off now and put it on the chain. And that's the last board. Kind of hard for you sitting in the audience to realize just exactly what's happening, but to those that lived so close to Lacoochee and so close to that mill, it's a rather traumatic experience. I'll have to admit that. Going through there, they're trimming it up now, and then this is the trimmer. Cut it up, cut the end into whatever length they wanted, cut off the waste pieces. That's Mr. Jace McIlvaine, and you'll watch just a second. He's grading that board, and when you see him make that slash and wipe his hands, you'll know that was it. That's the end of the cutting, and all of those that are around there are just waiting. And we thank you for spending a few minutes of your time. Those from Lacoochee, thank you.